Hey, fellow seekers, I'm Mr. Mythos. In the early 1960s, there was a Catholic priest who had it all. Father Pellegrino Ernetti was one of Italy's most accomplished exorcists, a world-class scholar of archaic music, and an elected delegate of the Vatican. But then, one day, Father Ernetti confessed to his involvement in a secret international operation. He divulged the existence of a device so powerful that it had to be disassembled almost immediately after its invention. Originally commissioned by the Pope, this device was codenamed the Chronovisor. Allegedly, the Chronovisor was a time machine capable of displaying historical events as if they were live broadcasts, including the crucifixion of Jesus Christ, potentially confirming the Catholic faith's truths, as well as its many inaccuracies, exaggerations, and even lies. We're about to enter a dark maze of religion, blasphemy, quantum physics, occult beliefs, and deep conspiracy. This is the complete Chronovisor mystery, a tale that stretches from accidental necromancy to a mysterious deathbed confession, and several decades of bizarre controversial events in between. As written numerous times by Catholic theologians and even repeated by the Pope, the Church remembers the future, and perhaps they do, if they've already seen it. But before we dive in, just as the Chronovisor would reveal the unseen, our sponsor Raycon just launched their upgraded model of their best-selling everyday earbuds, engineered to let you hear the unheard. The new everyday earbuds have active noise cancellation, quick charge function, IP66 weather resistance, and multi-point connectivity that lets you pair with two devices at once. And they come in several new vibrant colors. My favorite upgrade is easily the active noise cancellation. I like to go walking with my everyday earbuds and listen to ancient mystery podcasts, and Raycon must have employed a secret team of elite scientists to engineer these, because it's lawn mowing season, and my ears can't tell. I even started editing my videos outside, and my new everyday earbuds help me hear every word, undisturbed, and that's why I use them every day. If you haven't yet pulled the trigger on a pair of Raycons, with all these upgrades and a special deal for fans of my channel, I say now's the time. Click my link in the description box or go to buyraycon.com/mythos to get 20% off your Raycon purchase, plus free shipping. Thanks again to Raycon. It's time to tune into the utterly baffling mystery of the Chronovisor. One sunny, fateful afternoon in the early 1960s, two Catholic priests, one French and the other Italian, found themselves standing next to one another at the docks of Venice's Grand Canal. They'd been waiting patiently to catch the next Vaporetto, the Venetian public water bus. The two had never met before, but very soon they'd become close friends, and embroiled in the center of one of the most unusual and enduring mysteries in the history of the Catholic Church. In his book, The Vatican's New Mystery, published in 2002, the French priest Father Francois Brune recounted this moment in time. Quote, "It was 1964. I had the knowledge, by chance, of a very strange monk, Father Pellegrino Ernetti. He was waiting for the Vaporetto. I was waiting for it too. I don't know how the conversation began. The fact is that he ended up asking me, more courtesy than for a real interest, what I was doing and where I came from." End quote. Brune introduced a bit of his background to Ernetti, and as soon as they learned that they were both experts in ancient languages, the conversation swiftly kicked off. It wasn't long until Brune turned the subject to one of his most biting frustrations, the practical interpretation of the Holy Scripture. For those who've devoted themselves to what's often considered Earth's oldest and largest continually operating religious institution, the Catholic Church, small wars have been waged over accurate translation and interpretation of the original scriptures. Brune didn't hold back his feelings. Quote, "I immediately went on to discuss my irritation for the new exegetical tendency, which consists in considering the texts, and even the Gospels, exclusively for their concrete content. The tales of miracles would be nothing but fictions, metaphors for pedagogical purposes. The same words of Christ, only late literary constructions developed by the first communities. My joy was great to see that Father Ernetti completely shared my indignation. Without a doubt, it was the sincerity he saw in me that incited him to make an allusion to a mysterious device. Since his boat came and his direction was not mine, he added quickly, If you have time, come and visit me tomorrow afternoon at the monastery. We will talk about all these things with more comfort and privacy." End quote. As Brune boarded his Vaporetto alone and headed to his hotel, his mind churned over Ernetti's unusual response to his frustrations. While Ernetti clearly agreed with him, the Italian priest not so subtly hinted at a complete solution, that there wouldn't be any reason to doubt or debate about the contents of the Bible if some sort of device possessed by the Vatican was capable of providing definitive answers. Interpretation would never be a problem again. Father Brune had no idea what to make of the device, as the monk didn't elaborate, but whether it was a secret papal tool for divination or just an intellectual thought experiment, he was certainly intrigued. So, the very next day, Brune took the Vaporetto to the San Giorgio Maggiore monastery to accept Ernetti's invitation. This decision would irrevocably alter the course of his life. Father Francois Brune passed away in January of 2019, and up until his last breath, he vouched for the truth of the Chronovisor and the sincerity of his friend Father Pellegrino Ernetti. Brune's 2002 book, The Vatican's New Mystery, is rather obscure and difficult to read, with no English translation ever published. I ended up acquiring 2 copies, the French original and a slightly rarer Italian edition, so that I'd be able to cross-compare when translating and make sure I'm reading everything correctly. Brune's book is widely considered to be the most accurate and complete resource on the Chronovisor mystery, and yes, I manually translated both copies page by page and read the entire book a few times. It's a very unique and unconventional book. All throughout, it's very obvious that the Chronovisor mystery and the fate of his longtime friend Pellegrino Ernetti did genuinely haunt Father Brune for decades. As he wrote in the introduction, quote, "Observing the little that remains of disappeared civilizations so grandiose, there is a clear impression that oblivion, insensibly, holds everything, and that everything returns as if nothing had been. But I am convinced that nothing of what we say, we do, or even think is lost. There is nothing that one day should not be revealed," says the Gospel. Someone has truly realized an appliance that would allow you to know all this, to see, to listen to the men of the past. Not a reconstruction, but the event itself, when it really occurred. This man was a priest, like me. More precisely, a monk, a man of faith, prayer, and a man of science. Today he passed into the afterlife. He brought his secret with him, as they say in science fiction novels. He left traces, documents, but they are not accessible. They are carefully kept under key, preserved but hidden. I will explain why I keep the very strong impression that there has been and that there is something that the high authorities hide from us. Probably for the good of humanity." End quote. Brune's book presents his recollections, personal opinions, research findings, interview transcripts, and extensive investigations that he carried out after Ernetti's death, regardless of the threat to his own reputation and career. He believed in the Vatican time television and was fully aware of how crazy that sounds. The clock ticks, the past awaits. So, rewinding to where we left off, it was the next morning. Father Brune arrived at the small wooden doors of the San Giorgio Maggiore monastery and knocked upon them. The doors pulled open, and the French priest was met by Father Ernetti's humble smile, ushering him to come inside. The two made their way down the shaded, quiet hallway toward the monk's monastic cell. As Brune recalled, quote, "Father Ernetti's office was a large, long room with a very high ceiling. It included an immense table, also very long and robust, of solid wood, covered with books in evident disorder. The table was certainly ancient, as well as the chairs with their high backs, a little in the Louis XIII style. It would have been an extraordinary setting for a theatrical work, for example, for a performance of Faust. Only a phone seemed rather out of place and spoiled the whole setting." End quote. After exchanging friendly pleasantries, they sat together in the high chairs and spent time getting to know each other. their family, backgrounds, studies, careers, and general interests. It was clear the two priests had a lot in common, and a lot to talk about. However, as the icebreaker conversation dragged on for well over an hour, Brune could tell that Ernetti was avoiding the actual issue at hand, the mysterious device he'd hinted at the day before, and the reason why Brune had been invited over in the first place. Finally, Father Brune decided to ask directly, and the monk's face turned visibly serious. For a long moment, the room went silent. Quote, Father Ernetti probably regretted having committed too soon to a fellow brother, about whom he still knew almost nothing. So before coming to the revelation of this mystery, he wanted to test me. He then began to tell me an extraordinary episode, which was not yet what I was waiting for, but which was already itself a prodigious discovery, perfectly incredible, astonishing, and yet authentic. That day he would not communicate anything else to me, but it was enough to make me return to the hotel in the evening, completely bewildered. End quote. The story Father Ernetti told to Brune regarded the rather unusual origins of his work in paranormal research for the Vatican. On September 17, 1952, in a university laboratory in the historic city of Milan, Father Pellegrino Ernetti was filtering out harmonics from Gregorian chants using a wire recorder in order to obtain the purest audio of the chants. Working alongside him in the lab was Father Agostino Gemelli, a respected physician and psychologist, and a notable skeptic of paranormal phenomena. That detail is important because Gemelli would later verify that this incident happened exactly as Ernetti described. As the pair worked on the chants, their wire recorder began to malfunction. According to Brune, quote, Father Gemelli had an old habit, from the death of his father, like an automatic tick. Every time he was presented with some difficulties, he exclaimed, thinking of his father, "Ah, Dad, help me." That day, the wire recorder broke once again. "Ah, Dad, help me," he says immediately, as usual. After they set the wire recorder back in motion, instead of the voices chanting in Gregorian, a different male voice came through. "Of course I will help you. I am always with you." Terrified, Gemelli stopped the device immediately. Father Ernetti insisted, though, "We have to continue. We have to hear what comes after." He set the wire recorder in motion again, and the voice returned. "Zucchina, it is clear. Don't you know it is I?" End quote. This supernatural occurrence is actually elaborated on further in official Vatican records, in a report made by Archbishop Bruno Heim, the aide of Pope Paul VI. Quote, in 1952, two Catholic priests received a foreign voice that identified as Dr. Agostino Gemelli's father. They had the recording tested at the Laboratory of Physics of the University Cattolica del Sacro Cuore in Milan. The two priests could hear the voice very clearly. This was his father's voice addressing him by the nickname he used during Gemelli's childhood, Zucchina. End quote. As Catholic priests, both Ernetti and Gemelli were disturbed and quite fearful of the implications of communicating with the dead, even if it was by accident. As a form of necromancy, any communication with the dead is typically viewed as dangerous and forbidden by the Catholic Church. Thankfully, because Father Gemelli was president of the Pontifical Academy of Sciences, he and Ernetti were able to directly approach Pope Pius XII for guidance. According to a 1990 article in the Italian magazine Astra, the Pope responded, quote, "Dear Father Gemelli, you really do not need to worry about this. The existence of such voice is a strictly scientific fact and has nothing to do with spiritualism. The recorder is totally objective. It receives and records the sound waves from wherever they are coming. This event may perhaps become the cornerstone of a building for scientific studies which will strengthen man's belief in an afterlife." End quote. The Pope's unexpected reassurance lifted guilt and concern from both men's shoulders, and in particular, Father Ernetti found himself inspired in a way he never expected. Ernetti explained to Father Brune that as he continued the Gregorian chant experiments with Father Gemelli, he meditated on the Pope's words. The way Ernetti interpreted it, Pope Pius XII had suggested that sound waves from other realities and other times existed and could conceivably be picked up by a machine in the present reality and time. This idea was intriguing enough, but what if it could go further than just sound? Ernetti speculated that, just as sound is made up of waves, perhaps everything in existence might be constituted of not solid particles, but waves as well. This idea that waves might form the basis of all matter has strong roots in biblical scripture. Specifically, in the story of Genesis, the creation of the universe, earth, and all life within it is presented as a product of the Word of God, or an emission of sound waves from God, if the scripture is taken literally. In the very first chapter of the Hebrew Bible, the phrase "God said" is used 8 times, specifically for the methodical creation of everything in existence. So, could the truth be that everything is made up of waves, like the Bible seems to suggest? Well, modern quantum physicists say yes, and so did Father Ernetti. But the thing about waves is that they never actually go away. According to the principle of conservation of energy, a wave's energy and underlying quantum information never disappears, but is simply transformed into other forms. With all these ideas circling his head, at some point during the last of their Gregorian chant experiments, Father Ernetti was struck with a moment of eureka. What if somebody could engineer a machine capable of capturing and displaying the waves of bygone eras? A chronovisor, or literally a time seer. And this is how Ernetti's work with time machines began. Father Brune writes in his book, quote, "I don't remember very well how our first meeting ended, but what I'm sure of is that day I went back to the hotel completely stunned. As long as I was with Father Ernetti, his strength of conviction was such that what he told me seemed almost natural to me. But then, left alone, reflection took over. All of this was completely crazy. Did I dream of Father Ernetti, as if he were a mad scientist as we read about in comics or science fiction novels?" End quote. In any investigation, you need to know who you're dealing with, and Father Pellegrino Ernetti was quite the person. Born in 1925, at a young age he dedicated his life to Christianity, and over the years, he became recognized by the Vatican as one of the most talented individuals to have chosen the path. Beyond his ordainment as a priest, Ernetti became one of Italy's most accomplished and prolific exorcists. Father Gabriel Amorth, popularly known as the Pope's exorcist for his service as the official exorcist of the Vatican, wrote about Ernetti many times in his books with the utmost respect. Quote, "Father Pellegrino Ernetti, the most famous exorcist in the Venice area, who is also famous as a biblical and music scholar, experienced some very serious exorcism cases. He was a celebrated exorcist who had practiced in Venice for 40 years. End quote. During the peak of Ernetti's exorcism career, he received hundreds of patients each week. Father Brune notes that Ernetti was always careful to discern whether an individual was suffering from a psychological or physical problem, which required treatment from a medical professional, or a genuine demonic possession, in which case an exorcism ritual was appropriate. Father Ernetti even wrote his own book on exorcism, titled The Likes and Dislikes of the Devil. Ironically, for a man who apparently invented the time television, he actually lists the television as number 5 on what the devil likes. To be clear, I'm pretty sure he's referring to a standard television. That said, I found what he wrote about the television to be quite, curious. Speaking in the first-person perspective as the devil, Ernetti writes, quote, "The television, it is my device. I invented it, in order to destroy the single souls and the families. I separate them, I break them up with my subtle and penetrating programs. The television is the center of attraction with which I draw in so many priests, brothers and sisters, especially in the late hours, and then I do not let them pray. In an instant, I present myself in the whole world, and they listen to me, and they all see me." End quote. Make of that what you will. Now, speaking generally, there's no question that Father Ernetti was intellectually gifted. He exceeded in his education in a multitude of academic fields, holding doctoral degrees in ancient Oriental languages, philosophy, theology, and pre-polyphonics. In particular, Ernetti was a surprisingly influential, world-renowned expert in pre-polyphonics, also known as archaic music. Even more than exorcism, archaic music was his true gift and specialty. He spent the majority of his career researching and advancing this field, leading the pre-polyphonics departments of fine arts universities, and writing foundational works on the subject, such as Words, Music, and Rhythm, and his multi-volume magnum opus, General Treatise on Gregorian Chant. These works remain influential and referenced to this day. Father Ernetti had such a great ear that the Vatican even elected him as their delegate for the development of church music. It's an understatement to say that this man was extremely respected as an intellectual in the academic community, as well as a servant of God in the Catholic Church. In both worlds, his colleagues recognize his dedication and personal integrity. Despite becoming well known for his talents, he was never known to brag or exaggerate. In fact, most of his peers described him as a quiet intellectual. Looking at Pellegrino Ernetti's life, the Chronovisor was arguably the only controversy he was ever involved in. If we can look past the fantastical nature of the Chronovisor, all things considered, Ernetti actually seems to fit the bill for being involved in the development of such a device, especially one based on reading waves. But believe it or not, you might start to believe it, because this priest also earned a university degree in quantum and subatomic physics. And if all that wasn't enough, Ernetti's favorite hobby was tinkering with experimental electronics in his monastic cell whenever he found time off from what we can assume was an enormously packed schedule. As Father Brun recounted in his book, quote, "The electronics experiments of Father Ernetti fascinated me. I returned to Venice several times. Several times I boarded the same small vaporetto, and again I knocked upon that small door, very discreet, of the monastery of San Giorgio Maggiore. We have again discussed for hours of the Chronovisor." End quote. It was during these later visits that Brun received the revelation. Father Ernetti finally divulged to his friend his most precious secret, that several years prior, in the mid-1950s, he was involved in the development and testing of a device that teetered between revolutionary scientific achievement and mystical artifact. The Chronovisor was his code name, and now we're really getting into the beating heart of the mystery. Ernetti explained to Brun that the Chronovisor was a result of a secret project commissioned by the Vatican. Over the course of several years, a team of 12 hand-picked scientists developed and engineered it. The Chronovisor team included Ernetti himself, as well as Enrico Fermi, the winner of the 1938 Nobel Prize in Physics, and Wernher von Braun, the ex-Nazi engineer whose later work for the US space program landed Americans on the moon. Ultimately, this dream team was successful in creating a functional time machine. Father Brun could see that Ernetti was absolutely serious, despite the nature of his claims. According to Ernetti, quote, "The Chronovisor functioned by processing residual electromagnetic radiation left over by numerous processes." End quote. Like how a television picks up broadcasted signals, the Chronovisor was engineered to pick up on these radiation waves, switch between them as desired, and decode the information contained within to produce audio and visuals of the event. Aching to know more, Brun asked Ernetti to give him an idea of the structure of this machine. Ernetti responded, quote, "It consisted of 3 elements. The first block included a multitude of antennas suitable for capturing all conceivable wavelengths. These antennas were made of alloys that included all metals, and they were interconnected. The second block was a selector that operated at the speed of light. It could be set in a sort of closed circuit on the location, date, and person of our choice. By virtue of this, the device then followed them everywhere. Finally, the third part was simply made up of a viewing device that allowed us to record the images and sounds obtained." End quote. In terms of physical appearance, the Chronovisor might be described as a large cabinet decorated with cathodes, dials, levers, and antennas. It also had a large cathode ray tube on its front hooked up to a screen. So, altogether, the Chronovisor pretty much resembled a television. A very strange television. But unlike conventional TV sets, where viewers might tune into the History Channel, the Chronovisor tuned into history itself. A set of directional dials allowed the user to specify what era and location they wished to see, and on the small screen, the viewer could witness events that unfolded years or even centuries ago, giving them unquestionable insight into the mysteries of the past. And just in case the scene wasn't firmly ingrained in the viewer's mind, the Chronovisor was equipped with a built-in recording device to capture the footage for replay. In Father Brune's book, The Vatican's New Mystery, he presents a transcript of an early conversation he had with Ernetti, questioning the Italian priest about what it was like using the Chronovisor, and what exactly he saw through it. Quote, "What were you capturing? Sound? Images?" Yes, it wasn't like a movie, but like a hologram, three-dimensional in relief. The characters were not very large, roughly the size of our TV screens. Was it in color? No, in black and white, but with motion and sound. Today, however, color would certainly be possible. Could you choose what you wanted to capture, or did the device work somewhat randomly? No, we could actually adjust our device to the desired place and era. More precisely, we chose someone we wanted to follow. It was on him that we set the device, and so it followed him automatically, a bit like ornithologists who tag wild geese or storks to better study the movements and possibly to protect them. So the images you obtained were what he had seen? The captured scenes were observed from his point of view? No, of course, it's him that we were seeing. Each man possesses a kind of wave, a sort of emanation that is unique to him, somewhat like a signature, or like fingerprints. So it's someone that we see and continue to see in all his movements. It's always him at the center of the scene. The problem consisted primarily in finding him, by trial and error. Then the device was adjusted to the wave that emanated from him, and the device followed him automatically. So, what did you see in this way then? First, we wanted to verify that what we were seeing was authentic. So we started with a relatively recent scene, for which we had good visual and sound documented. We adjusted the device to Mussolini delivering one of his speeches. Then we went back in time, capturing Napoleon. Afterward, we went to ancient Rome. A scene from the Trajan's fruit and vegetable market. A speech by Marcus Tullius Cicero. The gesture, the intonation, it was all there. What vigor, what flights of oratory. Lastly, we lingered on a minor work, a type of ancient tragedy that was practically lost. It was known only through a few quotations by various ancient authors. Thyestes, that is the name of this minor work, was staged in Rome in 169 BC, shortly before the author Quintus Onios's death. But tell me, Father, when you proposed that I come to visit, it wasn't just to talk to me about Quintus Onios. You also spoke to me about the life of Christ. Did you really manage to go back to the life of Christ? Yes, of course. And then? First of all, we tried to capture the Passion, Christ on the cross, but it was not so easy. At that time, there were several crucifixions. We thought that we could still find him easily, thanks to the crown of thorns. Unfortunately, we had a surprise. The crown of thorns was not as unique as we thought. We then tried to go back to the Last Supper. It worked. And from that moment, we never left him. These scenes were captured between January 12th and 14th, 1956. We saw everything. The agony in the Garden of Gethsemane, the betrayal of Judas, the trial. We saw the ascent to Calvary, the way of the cross. However, medieval piety has somewhat distorted it, adding episodes. And Christ never fell. Moreover, he did not carry the whole cross. It would have certainly been too heavy. He carried only the horizontal beam tied to his shoulders. He was very disfigured. The scourging had torn strips of flesh from him. You could see down to the bone. But since Roman law required that the condemned must arrive alive at the place of his execution, the soldiers summoned Simon of Cyrene. We saw the scene as it is reported in the Gospel. But even there, piety has sometimes interpreted it a bit. We used to read beautiful texts in which we were encouraged to envy the role of Simon of Cyrene and to offer ourselves, like him, inwardly, to help Christ carry his cross. We clearly saw that Simon had no such desire. He had to be forced. Arriving at Calvary, Christ observes all those around him who insult him. Such majesty emanates from his whole being that everyone steps back, jostles, and falls to the ground. Jews, Greeks, Romans. Only Mary, the mother of Christ, John, and the other two Marys remain standing. I do not believe that Christ died of suffocation, as many doctors think. We saw him always standing upright until the last moment. And the resurrection, did you see that too? Yes, it's very difficult to describe. It was like a silhouette, a shape through a thin alabaster lamella lit up, or as through a crystal. Gradually, we then saw the rest of Christ's life, his appearances after his resurrection. Is there any trace left of all this? Yes, we filmed everything. This allowed us to show it later to Pope Pius XII, the President of the Republic, the Minister of Public Education. Members of the Pontifical Academy were also present. And now, what has become of this device? Dismantled, but in a safe place. Moreover, I have deposited the designs with a notary in Switzerland, and others in Japan. Naturally, there is also a copy in Rome. But why? Why hide such a discovery capable of shaking the world, of awakening faith that is being lost a little bit everywhere? This device can capture the entire past of anyone, completely, without exception. There are no more state secrets, no scientific, industrial, commercial, diplomatic secrets. There's no more private life. One day we caught a group of bandits preparing a robbery. We alerted the police, who were able to intervene in time. But the robbery was about to happen. Our device had not lied. It's a disruption, as you say, but so total that it scares some people. And it opens the door to the most terrifying dictatorship the Earth has ever known. In the end, we all agreed to dismantle the Chronovisor. End quote. Father Brune couldn't shake the sense of awe and unease enveloping him. The Chronovisor, if real and as Ernetti described it, was staggeringly powerful. It was difficult to comprehend these sheer possibilities. Quote, "But how did you discover something so extraordinary?" Practically by chance, a very simple idea, a bit like Columbus's egg. You just had to think of it. But then, someday, someone else will discover it too. No, it's practically impossible. It would take an unheard of stroke of luck. End quote. Seeing the flabbergasted look on Father Brune's face, Father Ernetti realized that some explaining was in order. The moment was ripe to dial back the timeline once more to the official commissioning of the Chronovisor project. How exactly a Benedictine monk ended up building a time machine in the company of some of the most brilliant scientists to ever live on a secret mission for the Vatican. At the alleged time of its construction, the Vatican did have a motive to develop such a device. Since World War II, the Roman Catholic Church had faced a sharp decline in global faith. Indeed, that situation would quickly change if biblical history could be witnessed and proven definitively. Pope Pius XII, who served from 1939 to 1958, hadn't forgotten about the recording machine incident with Father Ernetti and Gemelli that occurred in 1952. At some point later that same year, Ernetti's initial ideas for the Chronovisor reached the ears of the Pope. Allegedly, Pope Pius XII expressed overwhelmingly strong interest and offered Ernetti the funds to build it, on the condition that the priest was able to gather a team capable of such a feat. And this would obviously be a clandestine operation. It was up to Ernetti alone to identify, attract, vet, and recruit each candidate in secret. Thankfully, the Pope had the power to make this task a bit easier on the priest. Following the offer, Ernetti was appointed as the first chair of pre-polyphonic music at the Benedetto Marcello State Conservatory. More or less overnight, the priest gained access to some of the most brilliant scientists across a multitude of countries. This was how Ernetti managed to gather a secret league of 12 world-renowned experts in physics and engineering. Commissioned by the Vatican and with direct support from the Pope, their singular purpose was to break through the terrestrial shackles of time and space and invent a device capable of capturing the waves of history and displaying it on a screen. The details from here become quite murky. Out of the dozen that purportedly invented the Chronovisor, Father Ernetti revealed only 5 of his colleagues' identities. First, the Nobel Prize winner Enrico Fermi. Second, one of Fermi's disciples, unnamed. Third, a Portuguese physicist, Professor de Matheus. Fourth, a Japanese Nobel Prize winner, unnamed. And fifth, the infamous ex-Nazi engineer, Wernher von Braun. In his life, the only 3 names Ernetti ever gave were Fermi, von Braun, and de Matheus. Enrico Fermi, a Nobel Prize laureate in physics, was celebrated for his groundbreaking work in nuclear reactions and the discovery of radioactive elements. He was one of the designers of the first atomic bomb. You may also recognize the last name from the Fermi paradox, named after the prolific physicist. The Fermi paradox asked the simple question, if we aren't alone in the universe, where is everyone else? Which has never been definitively answered. The second participant mentioned, Wernher von Braun, was a former Nazi SS member turned esteemed NASA rocket scientist after World War II. Known widely as the father of space travel and the father of rocket science, Wernher von Braun's reputation was just as formidable as Enrico Fermi's. Von Braun was instrumental in launching the United States' first space satellite, Explorer 1, and the Apollo spacecraft that reached the moon. It's also worth noting that conspiracy theorists have long suspected that during the final years of World War II, von Braun had been working on the Third Reich's Die Glocke, or Nazi bell, which some sources claim was an early form of a saucer-type UFO, the first ever built on terrestrial soil. Others claim that it was an anti-gravity weapon. And of course, there are many occult researchers that insist that Die Glocke was a time machine, or even all 3 in one. So if anyone were to invent a chronovisor, Fermi and von Braun would be ideal candidates. However, neither of them could authenticate the invention or its inner workings because their names only became publicly associated with the project in 1992, decades after their death. And notably, if the chronovisor's development began in 1952, Fermi passed away just 2 years into the project. Moving on, Ernetti never gave the full name of the Portuguese physicist known as Professor de Matheus. The only information we know about de Matheus is found in an interview with Ernetti from May 2, 1972. Quote, "In 1957, I was called by the Cini Foundation to organize a center of liturgical music with specialized courses and training in pre-polyphonic music. It was during these courses that I met Professor de Matheus from Portugal, who had done careful studies on the texts of Aristoxenos regarding the disintegration of the sound." End quote. Lastly, Ernetti described one of the participants as a Japanese Nobel Prize winner. He may have not provided their name, but there's only one person it could possibly be, given that the chronovisor was said to have been developed in the 1950s. That would be the Japanese theoretical physicist and first Japanese Nobel laureate, Hideki Yukawa, who won the award in 1949, according to the official citation, for his prediction of the existence of mesons on the basis of theoretical work on nuclear physics. The next Japanese winner of the Nobel Prize wouldn't be until 1965, so it would have to be Yukawa. Yukawa's background in understanding fundamental interactions at the particle level would have been pretty useful in theorizing or modeling aspects of how the chronovisor might select and tune to specific electromagnetic signatures associated with historical events or individuals. Actually, this team is starting to sound surprisingly suitable for the job. Ernetti with his mastery of sound and acoustics, Fermi with his theoretical and nuclear expertise, von Braun with his engineering skills, and Yukawa with his knowledge in particle physics. And not to forget Demetrius, an apparently impressive scholar of ancient Greek acoustic physics. Demetrius could have contributed understanding of how sound waves travel and persist over time. But no matter how many geniuses you can fit in a laboratory, the project still needs to be possible. The problem with most time machines is that they're considered physically impossible, as traveling back in time creates temporal paradoxes and logical contradictions. But here's the kicker. One thing to keep in mind is that the Chronovisor isn't a traditional time machine. It only views the past and doesn't travel physically to the past, which helps avoid many of the classic paradoxes associated with time travel, such as altering past events. It would still require at least several revolutionary advances in physics and engineering, and sensors far beyond our current capabilities. It would challenge the known laws of physics to an extreme degree. But technically, as far as I understand, it doesn't violate the known laws of physics. The only caveat is that there'd need to be a small delay when viewing events with the Chronovisor, because a real-time transmission of information traveling faster than the speed of light would violate the principle of causality. Obviously, I'm having a bit of fun here, but with the Dream Team on point and the physical laws challenged but not broken, and a devout Catholic possibly opening a door for divine intervention, maybe the invention of time television isn't so crazy at all. If you know your physics, please leave your peer review in the comments, and for everyone else, that's enough physics for today. It's time to travel back to the story. Having heard all this, as Brun left Ernetti's quarters, he felt shook to the core and utterly bewildered. Though he didn't doubt the sincerity of his friend, this was a story wilder than he could wrap his head around. Thus, Brun would make many more visits over the coming months to fully grasp the story, the technology, and the implications. Everything had been dismantled, confiscated, or destroyed, so Ernetti couldn't provide Brun any evidence. These were the initial years of the Chronovisor story. Life moved on and Father Brun returned to France. However, his continued faith in the story seemed to give Father Ernetti more confidence to begin speaking about the machine to others, and eventually even go public. This, unfortunately, would open a floodgate that Ernetti would never be able to close. It would take some time before Brun would be pulled back into the loop, and realize that there was much more to Father Ernetti and his claims than what he was told, and things he'd never been shown. Evidence that the monk would later present to prove the Chronovisor's existence. Many years after meeting Brun, Ernetti made a controversial decision, and one he would certainly regret. He began to speak about the Chronovisor at public and academic conferences. One of the best-known occasions of this was on February 17th, 1979, at a conference held in the San Tommaso University in Rome. There, Father Ernetti lectured in front of an audience of scientists on the physical principle that explains the phenomenon of the voices of the afterlife and the Chronovisor. On this occasion, the monk spoke freely and frankly about the scientific workings of the device, with the same claims he'd made to Father Brun 15 years earlier. He explained to his audience and journalists that the Chronovisor had been dismantled, hence why he wasn't able to show it. The problem was that the public was not as accepting of Ernetti's claims as Brun had been, and quickly, enormous amounts of pressure began to mount for the monk to provide some form of tangible evidence. And so eventually, he did. The most famous evidence Ernetti produced was supposedly a genuine photograph of Jesus Christ. According to Ernetti, on January 12, 1956, the Chronovisor team ventured to the year 36 AD, the event of Christ's crucifixion, and returned with a complete recording of it, captured by the Chronovisor. Later, in 1972, a certain journalist named Vincenzo Maddaloni had heard the rumors of the Chronovisor that had slowly begun circulating around Venice and Vatican City. Maddaloni was perhaps the first to seriously begin pestering Father Ernetti for some form of evidence. After some time, the priest finally gave in and handed the journalist a photograph supposedly taken from the Chronovisor's recording of Jesus' crucifixion. On May 2nd, 1972, an article titled "A Machine That Photographs the Past Has Finally Been Invented" was published by the newspaper La Domenica del Corriere. In a single day, almost all of Italy was buzzing over Father Ernetti's fantastical and very shocking claims. The press had talked about the Chronovisor before, but this was the moment that the public at large first learned of it. The alleged photograph of Jesus Christ made the story a global sensation. Moreover, according to the article's author, Vincenzo Maddaloni, Father Ernetti also claimed to possess a photo of the Last Supper, which he kept private. The Last Supper photo would never be released, but the Jesus photo would become by far the most infamous image associated with the Chronovisor mystery. For example, I have a 40 Times magazine that features it on the cover, with Pope John Paul II setting it on fire. To put it simply, this photo was problematic, but it wasn't until several years later that a serious allegation of fraud arose regarding its authenticity. In 1980, a journalist from the magazine Giornale de Mystery published the following, quote, "I do not personally know Father Ernetti, and therefore I cannot afford to judge his person. On the facts, however, I can express an opinion. To this day, regarding his machine that photographs the past, we only have a large amount of 'it is said,' without any concrete evidence. The only fact officially disclosed in the press and endorsed by him as concrete proof turned out to be a colossal falsehood. I am referring to the image of the face of Christ that Father Ernetti delivered to some journalists, claiming that he had obtained it through his machine. Upon examination, this photo proved to be nothing more than the inverted reproduction of a devotional image that is sold for 100 lire at the sanctuary of the Amore Misericordioso di Collevalenza, itself a reproduction of a wooden sculpture by Culotte Valera, found in this sanctuary." End quote. The magazine presented a thorough documentation that proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that Ernetti's photo of Jesus was nothing more than a reversed image of a wood carving by the sculptor Lorenzo Culotte Valera, found on a local postcard. Unfortunately, Father Ernetti was unwilling or unable to provide an explanation for this. When side-by-side images of both began to turn up in magazines, this cast serious doubt upon Ernetti's claims of the Chronovisor. Of course, when Father Brun learned of this, it shook him to the core. Quote, "That day, I discovered that Father Ernetti, who had told me that he did not even have a photograph to show me, had given a journalist a photo of Christ on the cross obtained through the Chronovisor. But the most serious fact is that there was an absolutely identical photo on a postcard. The same image, simply reversed from right to left, same angle with the same lighting. Of all this, Father Ernetti had not mentioned any to me. However, after my initial shock had passed, I said to myself, no, it's not possible. This man was not lying. No, there was only one solution, to visit Father Ernetti. Our relationship was not of the same kind as that which journalists or even his fellow scientists could have. He would have certainly told me what he could not tell others, at least a small part, what was necessary to not compromise our friendship. Honestly, I don't remember very well how I approached the matter, whether I was very direct, at the risk of seeming aggressive, or if I managed not to give him the impression that I was starting to doubt him. In my notes, I find only his answers." End quote. The two priests sat upon the high chairs in Father Ernetti's monastic cell. Ernetti looked at Brun and indeed gave him an explanation that he'd never disclosed to the journalists. And it was complicated. According to the monk, he was well aware of the image from the Collevalenza postcard. The crucifix pictured was the work of a Spanish sculptor who had chiseled every last minuscule detail according to the directions of a nun known as Mother Hope. Mother Hope was not your everyday nun, but one blessed with divine vision and a history of incredibly intense mystical experiences. Mother Hope was what's known in Catholicism as a stigmatist, This is a person who bears bodily wounds, scars, or pain mirroring the crucifixion wounds of Jesus Christ, those in the wrists and feet from the large iron nails that pinned Christ to the cross, in the side from being pierced by the lance of Longinus, on the forehead from the crown of thorns, and on the back from the scourging Jesus suffered at the pillar. However, not only did Mother Hope relive the events of the Passion of Christ in her flesh, but she also experienced traumatizing visions of them on a regular basis. It was from one of these divine scenes, seared into her memory, that Mother Hope directed the sculptor to carve the crucifix. So, simply put, Ernetti was claiming that the sculpture was an absolutely historically accurate depiction, and that the photo of it, featured on a local postcard, was more or less a true image of Christ. But this elaborate clarification still didn't explain the fact that the photograph Ernetti provided to the journalist was not from a recording made by the Chronovisor. Father Ernetti had an answer for this, though. Going back to 1972, the journalist Vincenzo Maddaloni had been pestering the monk for evidence so frequently that it became a real annoyance. Same as Ernetti had told Brune decades prior, he didn't have any photos or recordings from the machine left in his possession. But the journalist would not accept this answer. Eventually, Ernetti decided to give Maddaloni a bone to gnaw on so that he could finally be left in solitude. He handed him a reversed photo of the postcard of Mother Hope's sculpture, without explicitly saying whether it was from the Chronovisor. The only thing the monk told the journalist was, quote, "Here, the Christ we saw with the Chronovisor was like this," end quote. After this exchange, Ernetti speculated that the journalist Maddaloni intentionally made it sound like the image was directly taken from the Chronovisor recording. And to the monk's credit, Ernetti never claimed to anyone else that the image was from the Chronovisor. However, he also never responded to the accusations of fraud. The media completely destroyed his image and legacy over this. If Ernetti had answers, why wouldn't he at least try to protect all that he'd earned over so many decades of honest work and devotion? Brune questioned the monk on this apparent logical contradiction. Quote, "Then why this silence? Why haven't you at least responded to all those who are asking for an explanation from you? I was not free. I had already spoken too much. I had an absolute prohibition from my superiors to give new explanations, to respond to accusations, to reassert the existence of the Chronovisor and the reality of the results obtained. In a way, the accusations against me were convenient for them. Since I could not respond, the discredit gradually discouraged any kind of curiosity. This is precisely what they wanted, from the time it was decided to dismantle the device and keep it a secret." End quote. Interestingly, Ernetti seemed to be implying that he was formally silenced shortly before the fraud accusations started, and this is consistent with other events in the timeline. Remember that the first expose that confirmed the Jesus photo as fake was in 1980. Just 1 year earlier, in February 1979, during the physics conference in Rome, Father Ernetti was still speaking freely and openly about the Chronovisor. He devoted his entire presentation at the conference to the Chronovisor's scientific function and the physics behind time tuning and time viewing. Unsurprisingly, it was tremendously popular and drew crowds of attendees. Many reporters and columnists in the audience went on to publish reactions to it. This was a defining moment in Ernetti's career, and likely the very event that prompted the Vatican to formally silence him. Because after this, he suddenly stopped talking about it to anyone. Brune suspected that Ernetti was immediately forbidden from discussing the device, either due to the storm of reactions it stirred up, or possibly something Ernetti let slip that he wasn't supposed to reveal. Either way, Brune discovered in his research that, quote, after the Rome conference in 1979, there were long years of silence. Later, in October of 1979, when Ernetti was invited to a parapsychology congress, everyone expected some information on the Chronovisor. Instead, he had prepared a 3-hour conference on the eschatology in the Bible, philosophy, and theology. 3 hours, without a doubt, so that there was no time to ask him questions about the Chronovisor. Then, during a congress organized by the astrology magazine Astra on October 18th and 19th, 1986, in Riva del Garda, the title of Father Ernetti's lecture was Theology, Science, and Magic. On that occasion, he spoke again about the Chronovisor, but it was only one of the topics evoked. Journalists who attended highlighted the extreme caution with which Father Ernetti had mentioned the Chronovisor without ever exposing himself, without ever suggesting that he could have played an important role in its research. Had he obtained permission from his superiors to talk about it, and within precise limits? That's what he had reported to my friend, Professor Ernst Sinkowski, on February 14th, 1987. What he, Father Ernetti, had said on the shores of Lake Garda at that Congress had been directly authorized by the Vatican. End quote. The photograph of Jesus Christ was not the only evidence that Ernetti revealed to the world before his apparent silencing. This other piece of evidence actually came first, but more importantly, is the only evidence for the Chronovisor that remains academically contested to this day. I'm referring to the same text that the monk had mentioned to Father Brune during their initial meetings, his handwritten transcription of the long-lost tragedy Thyestes, composed by the Roman poet Quintus Onios in 169 BC. The play is believed to tell the story about how Thyestes attended a banquet and was tricked by his brother Atreus into eating his own children. Despite Quintus Onios' fame and success as a playwright and poet, only fragments of his work have survived. The only reason why we know Thyestes existed is through the writings of ancient authors, whose various records preserved a total of 24 lines. So far as we know, the rest of the tragedy has been lost. According to the monk, his handwritten transcript of Thyestes was a product of their earlier tests with the Chronovisor. Near the tail end of 1955, Ernetti and his team had only recently completed the device and were testing it by traveling progressively further back in time. First, they visited a speech given by the Italian dictator Benito Mussolini so they could compare it to an actual recording and confirm whether the Chronovisor was working. Next, they traveled 100 years back to a speech given by Napoleon Bonaparte. Finally, they tuned their time television all the way back to ancient Rome, 169 BC. There, the Chronovisor team witnessed an ancient tragedy being performed on stage. As an expert in Latin, Father Ernetti quickly recognized it as Thyestes, the long-lost play, and began transcribing the dialogue by hand. In 1966, a decade after these alleged events, and 2 years after Father Brune met Ernetti, a Latin scholar by the name of Professor Giuseppe Marosca took an interest in Father Ernetti after reading about him in a magazine. Marosca got in contact, and the two swiftly bonded over their mutual love for the ancient language and Roman arts and culture. Just like Brune, Professor Marosca made enough subsequent trips to Ernetti's monastery that eventually he too would become privy to the Chronovisor. Ernetti only spoke to Father Brune about his Thyestes transcript, never showing it to him. However, Professor Marosca was very insistent, as this ancient play was directly related to his field of study. The Chronovisor was fascinating, sure, but getting a copy of that Thyestes transcript became an unhealthy obsession. Tired of the professor's continuous requests, Father Ernetti finally gave in. During one of their hangouts in the monk's monastic cell, Ernetti handed Marosca a box containing a bundle of papers tied together with a string, giving Marosca no context as to what it was. According to later newspaper reports, after Marosca went home, he untied the bundle, shuffled through a couple pages, and saw that there were Latin words. Immediately, he put the bundle back into the box, then secured his new treasure in a massive metal strongbox in his bedroom, locking it shut. For several years after, Professor Marosca kept the Thyestes transcript absolutely secret, but eventually he decided that this important work needed to be shared with the world. With Ernetti's permission, the professor gave a copy to a local Italian magazine, who then published it to far less fanfare than the Jesus photo that would come later. The article read, quote, "For 5 years, Marosca jealously retained the sheets in a box. without deciding to make something about it. Finally, he made a decision, and after having made the translation into Italian and obtaining the consent of Father Ernetti, allowed our magazine to publish only some of the passages. End quote. One of the standout issues presented by the Theistos transcription is that it's largely incomplete, just as the magazine mentioned, as Marosca and Ernetti only allowed a select few passages to be published, a total of 121 lines. Realistically, the full play would have been about 10 times longer. This is a point that many Chronovisor critics overlook, the fact that the transcript was initially presented as a fragment, nowhere near the complete work. So we can't be too judgmental on the lackluster length. That said, the actual contents need to be peeled through with a fine-tooth comb. While the Theistos transcript was initially overlooked, after the crushing wave of accusations spurred from the Jesus photo expose, the world became determined to debunk any further evidence of the Chronovisor and prove that it was all the concoctions of the mad priest, the nickname Ernetti became known by. So, in the year 2000, a Princeton University graduate named Dr. Catherine Owen Eldred, who holds a PhD in classical literature, translated Ernetti's Theistos text into English and gave her thorough analysis on the matter. If you'd like to read the Theistos transcript yourself, Dr. Eldred's work was published in the American edition of Peter Cross's book, Father Ernetti's Chronovisor, The Creation and Disappearance of the World's First Time Machine. The contents are in the form of hymns or prayers to the god Apollo, sung by Theistos. As mentioned before, Theistos accidentally ate his own children at a banquet, after his brother Atreus killed and cooked them for dinner. Now, trying to appeal for Apollo for help, Theistos spends most of the transcript singing praise about Apollo's attributes and retelling the story of the god's birth. After a long while, Theistos comes to realize that Apollo isn't listening. The group of friends around Theistos then beg Apollo to listen, but Apollo refuses. Out of options, Theistos curses Atreus angrily. Quote, "May Atreus perish in a shipwreck. May he, fixed on the highest, sharpest rocks, disemboweled, suspended over a vast expanse, sprinkling the rocks with gory disease and black blood. May he have no grave, no haven for his body, where his body may rest from evils, when his human life had been lost. And indeed, may Apollo not be beside him, and a cause for destruction be nearby." End quote. There are several reasons why Dr. Eldred suspected that Ernetti's transcript was not the real Theistos. She pointed out that the text contained words that didn't appear in the Latin language until centuries after the play was first performed. Also, the repetition of words suggests that whoever wrote it had a limited understanding of Latin. Obviously, Latin was the playwright Quintus Anios' native language, and he was known as a masterful writer, so repetitive vocabulary is rather suspicious. Finally, Dr. Eldred actually complimented the Theistos transcript, despite her confidence in its fraudulence. She stated that, overall, quote, "Some of it is quite good. Some of it is okay, and none of it is bad. It definitely has literary distinction." End quote. All this said, there are some surprisingly scathing critiques of Dr. Eldred's critique itself. Father Brune, who we know is also a scholar of ancient languages, including Latin, denounced the Princeton graduate's translation as not good, citing numerous errors. Quote, "Two huge errors right from the first two lines, and moreover, in very short verses. It's not insignificant. I will add that it is always wise to be very cautious in the use of such analysis based on vocabulary. To resort to such an argument, one must not choose the wrong word. Each error leads to another. Frankly, one has to wonder if this graduate of Princeton University has any knowledge of Latin grammar. The most amusing part is then seeing her comments. She believes she's analyzing the text, but is merely glossing over her own misinterpretations, marveling, for example, that the author speaks of madness, and even praising this madness. I see the madness in her translation, not in the text. Professor Marosca does not seem to have been troubled by the style or vocabulary of the text. However, he knew Latin. End quote. So apparently Ernetti's transcript of Thyestes is still up for debate. It's dubious and suspicious, especially in light of the fake Jesus photo. But this text remains the only potential evidence of the Chronovisor still left on the table. Obviously, that's a big issue. Beyond the Thyestes transcript, the only remaining support for the existence of the Chronovisor are the testimonies of Ernetti's colleagues, all of whom are esteemed and respectable individuals by most measures, but none of whom ever actually saw the time television itself, besides Father Ernetti. On April 8th, 1994, at the age of 68, Father Pellegrino Ernetti passed away. But after his death, the Chronovisor mystery would be stirred back to life in an utterly strange twist. In the year 2000, the editors of Peter Cross's book, Father Ernetti's Chronovisor, were contacted by an individual claiming to be a distant relative and a spiritual son of Ernetti, someone who was very close to the monk. This relative lived in Italy and had heard about their research for the book, and wanted to offer the editors a document pertaining to Ernetti, which he considered important, but only with the formal guarantee of absolute anonymity. Quote, "He stipulated that we were not to reveal his name, nor anything about him, apart from what was in the document. We agreed. The document arrived in our Florida offices a month later. In what follows, we are reprinting that document in its entirety. We've made efforts to determine the authenticity of this document and of its contents. We're not at liberty to say what paths we pursued in doing so, but we have reason to believe that the document is authentic." End quote. Written originally in Italian, yet only published by the editors in its English translation, this provocative document claimed to be the record of a confession made by the late Father Ernetti on his deathbed. According to this mysterious source, his father was a distant relative of Father Ernetti and had great respect and admiration for the monk. Since early childhood, his father brought him on regular visits to Ernetti's monastery, and as a child, he referred to the monk as Uncle Pellegrino. They enjoyed a very close and friendly relationship over several decades, even after the relative married and moved some distance away. The document read as follows, quote, "One night, a number of weeks before Father Ernetti died, I don't want to say when, I received a telephone call from him. His voice was low and quavering. That was when he told me he was dying. He asked if I could come and see him the next day. He told me it might be the last chance he would ever have to see me. I immediately went to Venice, very distressed. When I entered Uncle Pellegrino's cell, something seemed to be very changed about the atmosphere. Uncle lay very still in his bed. It seemed like him, but in a way not quite like him. He called my name. I sat down beside his bed. He told me that, the night before, he had thought he was going to die. He had become very ill and had lost consciousness." End quote. The letter goes on to detail that Ernetti had a near-death experience where he saw a white light and began walking toward it. In the distance, he was being beckoned onward by a figure he vaguely recognized. The following morning, when he'd regained consciousness, Ernetti realized that he had been in heaven. He felt incredibly weak. He didn't understand why he was still alive. Quote, "He said that he had not told the nuns or the doctors about this. Instead, he had telephoned me. He realized that he had been told during his near-death experience, and he remembered this when he woke up. Some things about himself which he had forgotten for a very long time. They mostly had to do with this life. But during this experience, he had also been told about a number of his other lifetimes, and that had opened his eyes to many things. Uncle Ernetti told me, 'My son, I am very, very fond of you. Sometimes I have presumed to think of you as my own son. I will not live much longer. I may even die tonight. Over the years I have told you many lies. I wish now to rectify that. I wish to tell you the truth.'" End quote. Father Ernetti pointed weakly toward the big wooden desk in his monastic cell and requested the relative to take a pencil and paper from one of the drawers and begin recording his words. He told his spiritual son that he could choose to do whatever he wanted with the information he was about to receive. First, the dying priest admitted that he'd forged a transcript of the ancient long-lost tragedy Thyestes. However, things weren't so simple. The near-death experience Ernetti had the night before forced him to a strange realization that it was he alone, and not Quintus Anios, who'd composed the transcript, using fragments preserved in the works of ancient authors. Father Ernetti could only vaguely remember doing this. He admitted that Thyestes was a lifelong obsession of his, and that he finally understood why exactly that was. Ernetti then told his spiritual son something even more bizarre. That while he may have not witnessed Thyestes through the Chronovisor, he did in fact witness the entire stage play in a previous lifetime. Quote, "I was a boy who saw that play. There was one scene that was burned into my memory. I wanted to remember and relive the rest. I remember the scene at the table, the cannibalism. My father in that lifetime was very cruel. All during my present lifetime, I've told people that I want to hear the music that accompanied Anios' Thyestes. But that was not true. I want you to know the truth. I said it to provide an explanation for an otherwise inexplicable obsession." End quote. From the deathbed confession, it's not clear whether his fraudulent copy of Thyestes was forged out of obsession, or if he actually transcribed the scenes from his vivid past life memories. Either way, Ernetti confessed that the only reason he claimed that he used the Chronovisor to obtain the text was because any other explanation would have been totally unbelievable. Interesting logic, but we'll roll with it. Finally, the dying priest decided that it was time to talk about the truth of the infamous device. As if to make sure his relative didn't get the wrong idea, he stated firmly, quote, "I did manage to build the Chronovisor, and once it almost worked." End quote. This is where things get truly interesting. According to the deathbed confession, the Chronovisor was absolutely real. Moreover, it wasn't anything like how Ernetti had described it to anyone else prior. Writhing on his deathbed, Ernetti recounted a pivotal event to his spiritual son. Quote, "It was a dark and gloomy day. I sat within it and turned it on. The Chronovisor was not like a television at all, but rather was a spear, much like a diving device, or one-man submarine, open at eye level in all directions. It was suspended by a cable, with a device that gave it free range of motion. It was made of a lightweight metal, an aluminum alloy. After locking myself into it, the world spun around me. It was powered solely by thought energy. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw, also spinning, a circular room, lined with something resembling files. The machine slowed, but would not stop. I believe now that the functioning of the Chronovisor is dependent upon a very specific belief structure. That very specific belief structure involves a certain separateness from time, a distancing from regulated, structured religions. But that was difficult for me because I was a priest. I count the failure of the machine as my own failure." End quote. The relative then asked the dying Ernetti how he was able to invent this time machine, and who exactly collaborated with him on this endeavor. The answer was, of course, unexpected. Out of all the scientific geniuses Ernetti previously claimed had worked with him, he only mentioned one. Quote, "I did know Enrico Fermi. He humored me, a very tolerant friend. I was alone in my belief. He did not work on the Chronovisor with me. However, one person helped me. A student. Not known to history. He is a priest now, and he will remain very silent." End quote. As improbable as it might seem for Father Ernetti and a student assistant to have invented something as profound as a Chronovisor all on their own, according to the deathbed confession, this wasn't the full picture, because the history of the Chronovisor and its development may very well stretch back hundreds of years. Clutching to his relative, Ernetti then made an incredible claim. Quote, "This was not the first lifetime I devoted to my endeavor of building a Chronovisor. It was a lifetime when I was a contemporary of Nostradamus. I knew him in the 16th century. He was an alchemist and a physicist. He too experimented with a Chronovisor. It was he who taught me that it might be possible. Nostradamus believed that it could be done by changing the vaporous body, that the body could be transformed in such a way that it could slip easily between times. We felt that we could achieve the vaporous body through alchemy, in such a way that we felt we could change the experience and control it with the body. Chief among our concepts was that of a round room, a round chamber which are placed the Akashic records. Off of this chamber are a multitude of paths, like a sun and rays. Each ray represents a different lifetime and a different time. In effect, it is a clearinghouse. End quote. There is quite a bit to break down here. According to the confession, in a past life some 500 years earlier, Ernetti worked with none other than the French astrologer and seer Nostradamus on the initial mechanisms of the Chronovisor. Many of you watching are probably familiar with Nostradamus for his prophecies and predictions that are argued to have come true, spanning hundreds of years after his death. Some of the events Nostradamus is thought to have accurately predicted include the Great Fire of London, the coming of Adolf Hitler, the dropping of the atomic bombs over Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and even the assassination of the US President, John F. Kennedy. So it's no surprise that Nostradamus is often called the Prophet of Doom. But on that point, if Nostradamus was so consistently correct, as many have claimed for centuries, what if he wasn't actually a soothsayer or seer in the mystical sense? Could Nostradamus have been the inventor of the earliest prototype of the Chronovisor, the literal time seer? Moving on, Ernetti seems to strongly imply that the Chronovisor relies on the use of alchemy. This little detail is interesting because, much like the mystery of the Chronovisor itself, the historical practice of alchemy can be seen as a crossroad teetering between the mystical and the scientific. Moreover, alchemy and the Chronovisor might both be seen as metaphors or literal tools of transformation and transcendence beyond ordinary limits. For example, the traditional goals of alchemy included transmuting lead into gold, or bestowing the alchemist with the ability to live forever. The Chronovisor apparently used alchemy for an even more ambitious goal though, to literally ascend the human body into some sort of multi-dimensional form, capable of freely traveling through time and rematerializing as needed. Also, for what it's worth, Nostradamus had at least a little understanding of how alchemy worked, having spent 8 years as an apothecary. Finally, what seems to be the most confusing part of Ernetti and Nostradamus' Chronovisor is the mention of placing the Akashic records inside the Chronovisor's inner chamber, as if the Akashic records were some sort of tangible object. If you're unfamiliar with this occult concept, the Akashic records are said to be the central storehouse of universal consciousness for everything that's happened or will happen. Every event, sensation, emotion, thought, action, and word of every living creature in the universe, past, present, and future. Some mystics argue that the Akashic records are an etheric dimension of consciousness, the mental plane. Others describe it as a universal energy field, vibrationally encoded. Either way, the Akashic records are supposed to be completely metaphysical, so it's not clear how Ernetti and Nostradamus plan to capture them in a physical form and fit it into the Chronovisor. Of course, that's probably where more alchemy was involved. I'm quite curious about how all this would work, so if you have any theories or thoughts, please take a moment and let me know in the comments. Ultimately, the most important twist in the story here is the idea that Father Ernetti, who was a Catholic priest, had apparently spent several previous lifetimes attempting to build the Chronovisor. Over multiple past lives, he tried to complete his great work, every time having failed but gotten further, and every knock upon death's door, vowing to be reincarnated once more to continue his endeavor. Quote, "My words were but the wistful desire of one who has failed. I shall return to try again. But there is one last thing that I must tell you about the picture of Christ. You know it now, I lied. Today, last night, I've asked myself many times, why? The answer is because I was hopeful that my Chronovisor would work. I was always so optimistic. I have no more to tell you, my son. All that I have told you is now yours." End quote. After Father Ernetti whispered these final words, the relative wept at his bedside profusely. Looking up from the tears, he saw the old man close his weary eyes and fall deeply asleep. It was a serene moment, seeing the monk at peace. But it didn't last long, according to the document, as Ernetti's eyes suddenly shot open and he sat right up, staring happily at his favorite relative. According to Ernetti's spiritual son, quote, "It was as if he were seeing me for the first time. 'My son,' he cried out. 'My son, it's you. I'm so glad you have come.' It was as if he now remembered nothing of what had come before, as if he had come back entirely to his old self and forgotten everything of his near-death experience and everything he had learned from it. I swiftly put away my notes. I told him nothing. That is my story." End quote. It's incredibly challenging to argue that this so-called deathbed letter is legitimate. It's confusing in the way that it explains Father Ernetti's fraudulent behavior and lies, while at the same time arguing for the genuine existence of a partially functioning chronovisor. Moreover, it makes some bold new claims, such as the involvement of Nostradamus, alchemy, multiple past lives, and particularly Ernetti's conviction that his soul would be reincarnated yet again to finish his work. We know that the real Father Ernetti was Catholic, so Catholic that he was a priest and a monk. Generally, Catholics don't believe in the idea of reincarnation, which is the idea that after death, the soul exits the physical body and migrates or transfers to a newly born being to begin life again in an interconnected infinite cycle of existence. At its core, reincarnation is thought to be incompatible with the Christian faith, and this is stated in the Bible, in Hebrews chapter 9, verse 7. Quote, "People are destined to die once, and after that, to face judgment." End quote. So for a Catholic priest like Ernetti, claiming reincarnation would be blasphemy. For this reason, among many others, Father Francois Brune was deeply suspicious of this anonymous document. Quote, "The document's author had read a little bit too much science fiction." End quote. Brune pointed out other errors and inconsistencies, such as how the document's description of the chronovisor didn't match the one Ernetti gave to him or other colleagues in the slightest. All this doesn't necessarily debunk this deathbed confession, but the sheer amount of unlikely claims and strange suggestions make it worth wondering why someone would make all this up, and then go through the trouble of convincing the editors of an overall very well-researched book this confession is authentic. And they successfully did so. It feels like something isn't adding up here. Father Brune didn't think that this was a mere prank document. He strongly felt that this document might actually be evidence of a group in a high position of power working to discredit Ernetti after death, where he could no longer defend himself or the chronovisor. Brune didn't spare any specifics. He argued that this so-called deathbed confession was one of two possibilities, either a complete forgery or a false confession coerced by the Vatican. In one of the final interviews Father Ernetti gave before his death, a 1993 interview with Javier Sierra, a Spanish journalist and a New York Times best-selling author, Ernetti pointed directly toward the Vatican. Quote, "Pope Pius XII forbade us to disclose any details about this device because the machine was very dangerous, because this thing is so important that it can affect the secrets of the state. It can be considered a secret of the state. This machine can cause a universal tragedy and take away freedom of speech, action, and thought. It will be possible to know by means of the machine what the neighbor and adversary plan, and the consequences would be twofold. Either the self-destruction of humanity or something more difficult, the birth of a new morality." End quote. Father Brune made more serious allegations toward the Vatican than Ernetti ever did publicly. Brune asserted that the Holy See had covered up the evidence of the chronovisor and hid away the research notes and blueprints in the Vatican secret archives. Moreover, Brune believed that the Vatican has been actively suppressing information about the chronovisor for several decades and used subversive techniques to pressure or perhaps threaten Father Ernetti to stay silent during his lifetime. Indeed, it's a fact that in his later years, Ernetti hired 2 bodyguards to protect himself. In a 2003 interview between Father Francois Brune and Javier Sierra, Brune revealed his final meeting with Ernetti and what he knew of the fate of the chronovisor. Quote, "I saw Ernetti for the last time a few months before his death in 1994. He told me that they just had a meeting in the Vatican with the last living scientists who had collaborated on its construction. Wasn't the Vatican already well informed about the Chronovisor? As far as I know, the Chronovisor has been dismantled, but Ernetti didn't have much trust in the Vatican. Already some years before, he told me that he had deposited his plans with a notary in Switzerland and Japan. Ernetti told me that he was urged by his superiors not to speak a word about it, and he suffered a lot due to this. When I interviewed Ernetti in 1993, he told me it had been Pope Pius XII who had prohibited him from speaking about it. Yes, that's right. Do you have any idea why he was prohibited from doing so? Well, Ernetti showed his recordings to the Pope, as well as the President of Italy, also to other scientists and cardinals, and their unanimous conclusion was that it was dangerous for humanity, because there wouldn't be any secrets, whether scientific, political, economic, or any private lives. Everything would be transparent. End quote. Father Brun's final encounter with Father Ernetti occurred on November 1st, 1993. 5 months before the monk died. Ernetti had specially arranged a meeting with Brun to tell him something of vital and timely importance. That a month before, on September 30th, the monk and 2 other surviving scientists of the Chronovisor team had been summoned by the Pope to come to Vatican City. When they arrived, they were instructed to give a thorough presentation on the Chronovisor to 4 cardinals and an international committee of scientists. These were the last words Brun ever heard Ernetti say. Quote, "We told them everything." Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this investigation and haven't seen my video, Time Mirrors, Experiments at the North Pole, that's a Russian time travel mystery that'll leave your mind spinning. Or if by chance you were intrigued by the notion of a time-traveling Catholic exorcist, and want to hear more about exorcism and the study of demons in Christianity, definitely check out one of my most popular videos, Demonology Explained in Obsessive Detail. Thank you to my patrons. Your massive support helps make it possible for me to do what I do for a living. 100% of all donations I receive go back into these videos. And if you're watching and inspired to help support my work, there are links in the description below to pledge monthly or make a one-time donation. And it truly means a lot to me, so thank you so much. I'm Mr. Mythos. Never stop seeking. I'll see you in the next one. Peace.